I think that the Taylor Swift or the Beyonce crowd loves that they get the access to this new work and that they get to see them on tour and they get to collect the merch and they get to like the Instagram. But I just don't know if they feel like they need to get paid for being a Beyonce fan. And that's where I just have a problem with it.
The over-financialization of everything
Literally.
is happening everywhere. And I think on the flip side of this, it's the community is feeling like they need to be rewarded for everything. And a certain degree of that is good when it's like surprise and delight and awesome. When it's I need to get paid for this is when I think it, becomes a little bit weird. All right. Sam, are we going to talk about meme coins today?
Not only going to talk about meme coins, Avery, but we're really going to just talk about meme culture because, a lot of podcasts over the weekend were talking about how this new Truth Social DJT Donald Trump stock is basically like a meme stock on steroids. And it did make me think that between that and all of these artists that have been releasing meme coins recently, that we're at like peak meme money. And I just don't know if it's a good thing. So I wanted to get your thoughts first.
What goes up must come down is one saying, and it's probably the apt saying for 99% of what's happening over the past few weeks with some of these crazy meme coins. I have gotten a lot of them airdropped to me, which always worries me because then I have to deal with it on my taxes. And I then have to figure out how to sell, either sell them, offload them, never touch that wallet again. I've noticed a lot of that because I personally haven't been very into it myself, been sort of following along, but I've just noticed these things continually dropped into my wallets.
Yeah, I think the thing that I worry about even more, and I feel like I say this way too often, but I'll just bring it again, is the idea that we also need to turn everything into a market.
Right.
That no matter what the thing we love is, someone wants to trade it. And it just really worries me when we think about that and the idea that sort of hyper financialization of the things don't need to be financialized in that same way are ever present. And, whether it's something like prediction markets where you can literally bet on anything at this point and any outcome, or it's, like an artist releasing a meme coin and then having to go through the psychological reality of everyone being really upset with them when they're not making more money, which is happening day in, day out right now in crypto. It just kind of feels like the short terms versus the long term thinking of money has just really corrupted a lot of creativity in ways that I just don't think are good. Wen and I, our producer, we were at dinner the other night with one of our old guests, actually, who comes from the music industry. I kind of posed the same question. And I think that the idea that fans and creative people and artists should get together is still very appropriate. And people kind of love that. The idea that fans and creators should have a mutually beneficial relationship, I think, is a wonderful experience. But the idea that the fans and the investors have to financially benefit as part of that relationship, I think is where it starts to break down for me. I think that the Taylor Swift or the Beyonce crowd loves that they get the access to this new work and that they get to see them on tour and they get to collect the merch and they get to like the Instagram. But I just don't know if they feel like they need to get paid for being a Beyonce fan. And that's where I just have a problem with it.
The over-financialization of everything
Literally.
is happening everywhere. And I think on the flip side of this, it's the community is feeling like they need to be rewarded for everything. And a certain degree of that is good when it's like surprise and delight and awesome. When it's I need to get paid for this is when I think it, becomes a little bit weird. And on the flip side, I know I'm not alone in sharing that I'm getting really frustrated by crazy tip culture. And I feel like I'm actually a very good, generous tipper. I would say very above average. And now it's like you buy a bottle of water from the bodega, check yourself out. And then it's like, did you want to leave 20, 25, or 30%? It's like, I bought a bottle of
Yes.
water and checked myself out. And I was actually just reading an eMarketer that tipping is 40% up year over year as a creator stream of revenue. And I think that's cool too. I like supporting the people
Yeah.
that I like, whether it's subscribing to their blogs or things like that, like ways to sort of support the people that you like, especially independent creators. But then I get a little annoyed when it's like, okay, so now if you want to follow me, you basically have to tip me. It's
Right.
like
Or I bought something in your Etsy store.
there's
Yeah.
financialization happening on both sides of the
Yeah.
spectrum where people expect to be financially rewarded for so many things. And then also these creators are like, if you're my fan, you have to pay to get access to X, Y, or Z. So I guess I'm grappling with that a little bit internally and thinking about the right way to navigate it for brands where I think sometimes like the win-win can just be so much stronger. The non-financial win-win and the people that you attract through financial incentives oftentimes are not the most loyal customers.
Well, also the idea of goodwill, which is a line item on a balance sheet for a Fortune 500 company, which is really the
Of
value of your
course.
brand, but it's still goodwill is meant to be emotional. It's not meant to be financial. And I think that also is a big challenge with it. Yeah, I think it's something we're going to keep talking about. I think that we at some point need to have someone on who like really studies this stuff and I think it would be really interesting to sort of understand from the perspective of why like I want someone to play the other side of why financialization of culture is good, and we need to find that guest soon. But before that, Avery, and before we get to our guest, you guys are doing a lot of work in the game space these days. Do any of your clients ask you what their game world smells like?
It's funny, like sensory branding is always a thing that kind of like percolates every so often. It's like, what does this credit card smell like? Why, Sam? I feel like you're leading me in. You're leading the witness.
I'm leading the witness because there's a new startup called GameScent, which has a little peripheral you attach to your computer, and it actually uses AI to analyze what's happening in a scene.
Wow.
And then it will push an aroma at you to have a sensorial experience while you're playing your game. The initial smells, they have gunfire, they have explosions, forest, racing car, which I think smells like burned rubber, and then also clean air, which is important because it has to get rid of the other smell. But the idea, I just don't know if I want to be going through, my game world and then smelling the zombie I just killed.
It's called immersive experience. And some people are gonna like it. Some people like that type of thing. It really reminds me of like Axe has been really active in the gaming space and they've done a bunch of like little sort of stunts and pranks like that. So we should have Jamie Brooks on one day. He would have a lot of good insights around what Axe smells like in the world of gaming.
I would love to have that discussion. But I do think as the world gets more sensorial, as we are in more mixed and alternate realities, maybe scent, maybe texture, all these things are going to be the thing that we're going to be paying attention to. Got
I
to
think so too.
keep listening to Gen Z to find out. All right, after the break, we have Adam Levine. Adam is a really smart guy who studied math and social sciences and all of this stuff, but then he got his graduate degree in art history and now is the director over the Toledo Museum of Art and a really sort of intellectual thinker when it comes to art and provenance and why movements happen, and just super excited to have him on the show. So when we come back from the break, we'll be here with Adam Levine. Consensus 2024. Global crypto regulation, the disruptive power of AI, the rise of tokenization. Consensus is the one event where experts convene to talk about the ideas shaping our digital future. Join developers, investors, founders, brands, policymakers, and plenty more in Austin, Texas from May 29th through the 31st. The 10th annual Consensus is curated by CoinDesk to feature the industry's most sought-after speakers and provide unparalleled networking opportunities and unforgettable experiences. Take 15% off registration with the code GENC15. Register now at consensus.coindesk.com, and I'll see you there. Welcome back. We're here with Adam Levine. Adam is the Edward Drummond and Florence Scott Libby President, Director, and CEO at the Toledo Museum of Art. And Adam is someone who I met through some mutual friends, has a really deep knowledge in both the art space, also knows a surprising amount about things like math that we're going to talk about, and algorithms and things that relate to kind of what we are also interested in, the NFT and digital collectible space. And I also think he has a really good sort of perspective on a question that we've been asking a bunch of people, which I still think is very unanswered, which is crypto art even a movement? And is it something that we should be paying more attention to? So, Adam, I would love for you just to tell us a little bit about the Toledo Museum of Art and sort of your own history in art.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And thanks so much for having me, Sam and Avery. It's really great to be here. And as I've gotten more engaged in sort of digital art broadly, and then, crypto art was within that, which is a topic we'll come back to. It's really just sort of an honor to be able to share our emerging views in Toledo. Yeah, so the Toledo Museum of Art was founded in 1901, and my very long title was actually just a fancy way of saying Edward Drummond and Florence Scott Libby were super important to the founding of the museum. Libby Glass still makes 90% of all restaurant glass in the United States, and Edward Drummond Libby founded 3 other companies, all of which entered the Fortune 500 through the industrialization of glass production. So Toledo is the glass capital of America and in some ways of the world. And what you find in the Midwest, and I'm a born and raised New Yorker, so Toledo is not on the 5-year plan, but like the zeal of the convert is a real thing. I absolutely love it. It's an incredible place, incredible museum. What you find in the Midwest is you find incredible industrial wealth was parlayed into sort of a real sense of sort of civic support. And it manifested in these incredible arts institutions, of which the Toledo Museum of Art is one. And that history is unquestionably checkered, but the impulse to do good for community manifested itself in museums like Toledo. So Toledo's distinction is that it feels like a mini Met. It feels like it's got one of everything, but in fact, it was founded with an ethos to only collect the very best. So we don't have one of everything, but everything we have is as good as anything you'll find anywhere else. And we trace 6,000 years of human history from ancient Egypt through to contemporary digital art. So it's an incredible platform to tell the stories of today in a historic context. My background, as you alluded to, is less linear than the press releases that you read might suggest, but I studied art history. I also studied applied math, but new museums were important to me from an early age and was fortunate enough, privileged enough to be taken to them as a kid and generate a sense of comfort and wonder in them. So the idea of working for one was actually something that I brought with me to college. But in the intervening period, spent some time in finance, spent some time in the startup world before ultimately getting my PhD in art history and beginning a very traditional museum career at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And that sort of matriculated into leadership work in the museum field and now serving as the director of the Toledo Museum of Art.
I'm going to be honest, Adam, I actually thought this was like Toledo, Spain. So I'm really learning a lot on this podcast already.
Well, we were the first sister cities, Toledo, Ohio, and Toledo, Spain. And Toledo has its own great museums. And we're bonded together by a mutual love of El Greco. We did a major exhibition on the artist in 1988 when I was 2 years old. So I wasn't around for it.
You
But
had
yeah,
a lot to do with it.
obviously, I'll take all the credit.
That's so great. Have you been to Toledo, Spain?
I have been. I have been not in this role, but backpacking one summer during college.
As one does.
As
As
one
one
does.
does. As one does through Spain. So, as someone who studied both abroad and in the antiquities and sort of social sciences, can you tell us a little bit about sort of your interests in the rise of digital art and sort of blockchain based art?
Yeah. So to take a step back, I'd say my personal interests are around digital or about art and therefore every genre of art, right? Of which digital art is a type because it is using a particular set of media. And was interested in blockchain as a technology because it is a technology that has a lot of utility. As those two intersected, I obviously took notice because one of the peculiar things about the art world is that while artists are the most innovative people you can imagine, the art world is not necessarily always the most innovative space. So it was quite peculiar to see the art world at the vanguard of tech. Artists are, the art world is not always. So certainly that intersection was of interest. And, while I was sort of personally interested in both digital art as a practice that frankly has been ongoing now for decades, the moment there's a new technology, artists have always played around with it. We have a member magazine, and I actually pointed this out in the member magazine. The moment the Romans invent the running drill, or a sufficiently technologically capable running drill, artists are using it to drill deeper holes, right? This is not new. Artists are creative and use whatever techniques are available to them to make works of creative expression. So it's no surprise that as soon as something like blockchain emerges, artists start saying, well, how are we going to use this? So my interests run in parallel, and then obviously where they intersect, I get really geeked out. And this was no exception. So the interest sort of emerged gradually, and we sort of sat back and watched our curatorial team and we started to think about what are the ways that we can engage, and frankly, what are the ways that we can support exploration in the space. Because whenever new technology emerges and it gets onboarded into anything, we all know the hype cycle. It's true of everything, right? There are some of these sort of transhistorically true laws. We really look at moments like what we've experienced over the past few years and say, like, well, what's true, right, about this intersection? Where do things look like they might settle? And how do we promote greater creativity with the use of these varying tools to try and push forward, legitimate and interesting artistic practice?
Adam, I've always been sort of fascinated by how collectors, how investors, how museums choose the things they do, because so much of art still seems very subjective. And maybe there's some curator or some Saatchi type who's blessed a specific artist. I think about when I used to go to the Frieze Festival or Art Basel, and like there was a couple of years where neon was everywhere. Or it could be mosaics at this point, or maybe it's digital art, in certain areas today. And as a follower of art versus a leader in art, I think I'm just probably seeing the fact that other people are saying this is stuff that people are interested in. But I guess as someone who's, you mentioned that you guys collect ideally the best of the best when you collect. So is part of the way you, from a criteria perspective, is that more about, well, we know we want an artist specifically, so we just want to make sure we're getting the best representation of their work? Or is it, hey, we really want to be in mixed media, and so therefore let's find, the 10 artists that represent that? Or there's a trend coming, and so we want to be in front of that. I guess I'm really interested in how you guys think of things that are trends versus things that might be more movement based, if you will.
So I guess there's a bunch to unpack there. So interject at any point.
Classic Sam question. There's like a four-parter.
Yeah, well, I was actually thinking, I think there might be 4 parts to that. So let's start with some definitions first, right? So everything cycles. So trend is a function of time. So you can look at something from one fair cycle to the next and say, okay, there was a trend this year and it's a different trend the next year, right? Or you can take a multi-year view. I think some of the trend you identify is based on the period that you're analyzing. The Whitney Biennial just opened, and I think it was Ben Davis from ArtNet, who always writes super thoughtful stuff, said he saw a lot of body castings, people casting body parts, which is super interesting because we have the Marisol retrospective is open in Toledo right now. Marisol was casting her body, a long time ago, to say nothing of sort of, examples of this throughout art history. So it's sort of like, what is your period is a relevant consideration. But with that said, the extent to which trends are actually most relevant to this museum, right? I can't speak for all of my colleagues, are in relation to value. So one of the things that we have to do is we don't just have to buy great art, and also we'll come back to quality in a second, Sam, but we have to buy great art in a way that acquits ourselves of our fiduciary obligation. So we need to get great value, but we have to get great value over a long period of time, because we're 125 years old, and our investment horizon is quite literally, it says in our investment policy, it says it's perpetual, it's infinity, right? So we think over the long term. It has been a practice of this institution for most of its history to expressly focus on buying against the market, or in the contemporary space, buying early. And again, those are things that we can unpack. But I think what that means for us is we kind of expressly like to be off trend. And for us, early doesn't mean that we're doing things first. We've sort of thought about this and said, we at the Toledo Museum of Art, we want to be in the space of fast followership. That's the type of innovator we want to be. So being a fast follower means that when you see something that you think is durable, so when you see something that you think will emerge into a trend, then you jump on it. And the way that we think we identify those is because, as we've already described, the art world isn't necessarily first on trends. We look at adjacent spaces. And when it looks like, people are figuring things out, when it looks like, say, big corporations are making big investments into Web3 and blockchain, then we think, okay, they're laying groundwork for long run infrastructure. And we think to ourselves, okay, this is a space that's going to be durable. So how are we going to engage? How are we going to play?
Adam, just to interrupt you, is this like a Moneyball approach where there's a lot of data nerds who are just sort of looking at all of these different trends and saying, therefore, body parts are going to be big in 2 years, and then we got to find the right artist to put?
So this is more about how we use scarce resources, right? There are parts of the market that are definitely hotter at any given moment. But I think, we are not looking so granularly to say, oh, no, there's a trend in body parts. We're looking more at geography, chronology, and medium when I say like certain parts of the market are hotter. So now let's get to this point about sort of like quality and how we think about filling gaps to the extent we, think about filling gaps. So, quality is a bit of a contested term. Well, I guess the first thing, and to say it like a little bit glibly, right? You occasionally run into people who deny the notion that quality exists. And to those people, I say, come visit the Toledo Museum of Art. I've taken at least one artist around who, in his work, flatly denied that there could be such a thing as quality. And then over lunch, after spending a morning at the museum, said, well, maybe. It is sort of a knock your socks off kind of place. And therefore, I think it's worth unpacking quality a little bit. There are 3 components to quality. The first is something well made. And I think this is actually a big challenge for folks and for consumers of viewers of digital art. It was one of the reasons it was so important for us to choose Osinachi as our first digital artist in residence, because, most people have picked up a paintbrush in their life. And whether you like Mark Rothko or not, and if you don't, you should, but whether you like Mark Rothko or not, that's a very difficult thing to make. And you have some sense of how difficult it would be to make a painting of that scale with that sort of color variation. It's hard for people who haven't used some of these digital artistic tools, but everyone's used Word. Everyone has used Microsoft Word. So when you show someone Osinachi's work and you say he made that in Word, there is this sense of like a jaw drop, right? There's that moment. So something has to be well made, which is to say it has to exhibit incredible facility with its craft, whatever that is. And therefore, you create some room here for craft looking different in textile than it does in painting, than it does in glass. And we have an incredibly large collection of glass. So there's worth taking a pause, Sam, before getting to the other two criteria, because what you can see emerging here is so much of the conversation on quality is, well, quality is subjective. It's not objective. Well, actually, it's neither. It's normative, which is this thing in the middle. And this is why taste can change. It's why there's such a thing as a vibe or a zeitgeist, right? It's actually consensus driven. And then, as we know, there are certain nodes that are more influential, call them tastemakers, call them gatekeepers, call them whatever that you want. But networks arrange around central nodes. So I think a lot of what we're talking about in terms of quality is normative, and therefore it can change over time, but there's like a band in which it changes. So there is some durability to it. So is something well made? The second is it of its time? Does it reflect its time in a way that is unique to that moment? And that is the historical view. And, again, my sort of like cheeky way of thinking about this is you can go to any seaside town and get a competently executed impressionist painting tomorrow. But there's nothing, what makes the impressionists important was how radical it was and how it could only have reflected an interest in optics, right? The technologies of paint that allowed them to be outdoors. It was the interest in industrialization and in the effects of city life, and therefore in the diminishment of the countryside. Like all of that had to recombine into something that was uniquely of that second half of the 19th century, late 19th century. So is it of its time, or like, if you want to be really fancy, historicity? And then the third component, which is like, let's not uncork, German aesthetics. That's like not a podcast. That's a glass of wine or a beer. But is it beautiful? And beauty, again, like, is that subjective? A good way to think about beauty, which a philosopher, could come on and totally critique for the purpose of this conversation, a good way to think about beauty or like the aesthetic value of something is, does it make you, the viewer, feel the same thing the artist felt in creating the work? Or maybe more precisely, does it make you feel the emotion the artist intended you to feel, right? In an unmediated way, mediated through the artwork, right? Not mediated directly through the artist. If the artist can convey emotional valence through a work, whatever the medium, do it in a way that is well made and do it in a way which is uniquely of its time, that is what we mean when we say something is a quality work of art. So how do we fill gaps? We fill gaps that in our model, because we're collecting all of human history, we look for where we have gaps in types of craft and medium, gaps in chronology and geography, which is also code for culture, to make sure that we are telling that history globally. Because a global history not only showcases quality as fundamentally democratic and fundamentally inclusive, but then the history is true, actually, in point of fact. It is a true and inclusive history of human creativity. So sorry, that was a monologue, but that's the way we think about it.
It was a monologue, but you brought up a lot of really interesting points, Adam. And, I was actually planning to ask you about your artist residency. And I think it's debatable if everyone who sees a Rothko knows the amount of craft that goes into it. And I think especially if you look back in history when those paintings were first sort of released, I don't think that was necessarily the prevalent school of thought at the time, though that's evolved. And that could be true for this African artist, Osinachi, as well. Yes, everyone knows how to use Word. Everyone knows how to pick up a paintbrush. That doesn't mean you can like craft something that really makes people feel, makes them think, triggers their hearts and minds in new ways, which is one of the reasons that we all love art so much. So can you tell us a little bit about this artist, how you decided to work with him as your first artist in residency? I believe you all have another artist coming up who's also African. Is this sort of an interest of the museum? Give us a little bit of color here.
Yeah. So I guess just first on Rothko and back to this point about sort of like trends and value. So I would say that a lot of people who would have said at the outset, seeing any work of abstraction, oh, you sometimes hear, I could do that, is actually responding to the iconography. And to this point about like when you buy, this is why you buy early, right? If you're a collecting institution or a collector, like actually, if it's plain to see, it's well painted if you bother to look at how it's painted. But if you're not looking at how it's painted, then you miss your moment. The Louis Vuitton Foundation show, to which we lent our Rothko, we only have one and it's great, will never be done again because the insurance value is so high, right? And so like get it early or don't. So the decision to engage Osinachi was sort of, as I said, refracted through this lens of quality, undoubtedly. I think not just an incredible opportunity for us to, support an incredible artist, but he was just such an incredible human. It's just so great to work with. But I think the other thing which is sort of helpful to know, sort of peeling back the curtain a bit, is institutions think a lot about alignment with program. So a huge part of the reason that we chose Osinachi or invited Osinachi chose us, right? I mean, it was sort of a mutual thing. But we invited Osinachi in the first place to participate as the first artist in residence is because last year we did a show basically on transatlantic modernism. So specifically looking at the relationship between Jacob Lawrence and Nigeria and two residencies or one residency, two trips Jacob Lawrence took to Nigeria in the 1960s, but then expanding that, sort of using that as the gateway to talking about Nigerian modernism, African modernism, and the effects of African modernism on global modernism. So the exhibition was called Black Orpheus, which was sort of one of the seminal publications that came out of Nigeria in that period. And it made sense, therefore, as we thought about sort of Jacob Lawrence's trip to Nigeria for a residency, to think about, well, what would that look like in reverse? Because here we are, we really want to tell the story about African influence on modernism. So Osinachi, I think, is having similar impact on the digital art world. And there was thus this really, really nice programmatic fit. And Osinachi was game and interested and agreed that there was and produced some exceptional work here as part of the residency. So that was the decision in the first instance. So similarly, our second digital artist in residence aligns with a major exhibition that we're opening late this summer into early fall. So we're co-organizing the first really major exhibition of historic Ethiopian art in the United States in more than 60 years. So again, we invited, I'm fortunate to have accepted, an artist whose artwork aligns closely with that program. We will announce sort of details of that shortly. And for keen-eared listeners, you may be able to intuit just with enough information there who it might be. But that's all I'm going to say for now, other than to say we're super, super excited about it. What I would say, though, Avery, like to the extent there is a trend here, it's that our program is global and digital art is global. Therefore, there is quality in digital art production everywhere, period, full stop. And one of the stats that I used in Miami, at a panel, there are 200 million people in Nigeria. There are 120 million people living in Ethiopia, and there are about 350 million people living in the United States. So access to infrastructure, access to art schools, et cetera, may be different. But in terms of raw talent, there is as much in Nigeria plus Ethiopia as there is in the United States because math. Talent is equally
The
distributed.
math is mathing on that one.
That's
Yes.
right.
I would also say, Adam, we had the pleasure of working with Osinachi last year for a project here at CoinDesk. Not only is he a completely lovely human to work with, you go down and you start to look at his work. It doesn't look like a traditional NFT that we would think of from a Bored Ape Yacht Club or Doodles or something. I mean, it's truly creative art forward. And then you find out that he does the whole thing on Microsoft Word, and it just blows your mind that how does this become that, is which I also think really lends itself really well to the story of him as a creator and him as an artist, and the process, and probably the access to tools that he had also as he was growing his career. I guess I want to ask a bit more of a meta question, which is, and I don't know enough about the art world like you do. I know very little bit, but it does still seem that when we think of who are the canonical artists of our, not even our time, of history, they tend to still be European, occasionally American, mostly white, mostly male. I go down these really deep rabbit holes both African art and Indian and tremendous amounts in Asia. And when I was at Mexico City and Verzonamaca last year, like seeing incredible work coming out of Central America and South America. Why is it so hard for any of that, at least in the US, to break through? That there is a rich history also and foundational artists of any time that should be in that canon, but the biggest museums in the world haven't recognized them mainly.
I'll say, Sam, I've had enough conversations with you to know that you know a lot more about the art world than I think you just let on. So the museum world inherits Eurocentric views because of our origin story, which doesn't mean that museums aren't incredible organizations that have the capacity to tell broader stories, but it does mean that was sort of our founding ethos, and we structurally have a lot of those biases still built into us. So systems change takes time, and we're in the process of redressing a lot of those biases that you just mentioned, Sam. And that's why our acquisition strategy is so focused on finding quality in these gaps that we have in our collection. We may collect 6,000 years of human history over 6 continents, but it is not evenly distributed across those 6,000 years or all 6 continents. So there is a correction which is required.
Can I stop you for a second? I want to just pull on that thread for a little bit because I think you're correct. And I'm not talking about actually what you guys do because I think you guys are very forward thinking. I do think, though, that whether we're looking at Berkeley Hendricks in the 70s or we're looking at Basquiat in the 80s, we've had 50 years at least of, let's say, Black American artists starting to get recognition, or the Kehinde Wileys of the recent times. But still, yes, you'll see a piece here and there. And maybe, and I guess from a time horizon perspective, is that part of it in the sense that, maybe 50 years actually is too small for them to be considered in a Van Gogh?
Well, I mean, his timeline is forever. So at Toledo,
Forever is a long time. You're right.
It is. Well, some of it is institutions move slowly, and we have had a lot of work to do, and systems work takes time, which is not an excuse. It is part of what is happening, and it's happening in an overdue way. But the other thing that your question really gets to, Sam, is museums do help set the canon, but there's a lot that happens before something shows up on the museum's wall, and that infrastructure is stacked very much towards the Western world, namely market infrastructure and media infrastructure. And there are all sorts of biases that accrue from that. To use a very, separate example, the Toledo Museum of Art is going to be in the New York Times a lot less than a comparably sized New York museum. Part of that just has to do with the fact that the New York Times is also New York's newspaper. And that's where many of the journalists live, especially those on the arts beat. And it is less convenient and harder to get to Toledo than it is to get from one's apartment to whatever gallery. So some of it is also where some of this infrastructure is located also results in sort of differential coverage and differential representation. But that is different than the distribution of quality. So if and when, I don't know, Sam or Avery, what your plans are, but if you go to the Venice Biennale this year to see this, what I anticipate will be this incredible exhibition that Adriano Prados is putting on, Foreigners Everywhere, you will see a very different art history, and it will be no less exceptional than a Venice Biennale of decades ago. And this is a shift which has been underway in some of these more nimble arts spaces that are institutional, quasi-institutional, namely biennales. And I think you're going to see this change continue to sweep over the world. But make no mistake about it, there is also going to be new infrastructure built that will support greater equity in storytelling and representation at every step, including up to museums, but long before sort of something ends up on a museum's wall.
So in the timeline of the beginning of time to forever, at some point, we will have representation in the art canon of a more diverse set of creators.
Yeah, well, and I think the other thing, now I can go back to sort of, the terrain I feel more comfortable sort of discussing with authority because I have some control over it, the Toledo Museum of Art rather than museums in general. I think one of the things that if you were to look at the acquisitions at the Toledo Museum of Art over the past few years, you would see incredible equity across all of the criteria I've articulated because we set that for ourselves as a goal. And because we focused our efforts. So amazing what happens when you're aligned and you put resources against something. Now, with that said, it would take decades for us to get to parity in some of these areas if the collection were our denominator. And that is certainly something which should be aspirational. But there's the thing we can control is we can constrict that denominator by thinking about the stories we tell in our galleries, which are what most people see. So I actually think you will see equity way more quickly at the level of display than you will at the level of collection, because the footprint is smaller, because the number of objects on view is less. And as long as there is intentionality around that, then I think you're going to end up seeing accelerated display in the museum context, accelerated equity and display in the museum context. Yeah.
So let's talk about sort of the financialization of art, Adam. How much of that do you think, in your sort of perspective of the museum, your time window is forever? How do you think about other art collectors and how they visit museums, how they interact with museums? Are they doing this for the love of the game, the love of the art, the love of discovery, or are they doing this as an investment vehicle in specifically the context of digital and crypto art?
I think the answer is all of the above, whether it's digital or crypto art, or otherwise, right? There's a blend. And I do think one of the things that happens is we try and create some of these distinctions, but people are people. People use the tools available to them to make investments, right? To buy things that they're passionate about. And there's a blend in every space. Same with car collectors, same with sneaker collectors, same with trad art collectors, same with crypto art collectors. As I distinguish between sort of financialization and leverage. And because, right, leverage is a tool of financialization that I think, and again, every area of the economy we can see can be overused to disastrous consequences. So I think a little bit of leverage is healthy. I think a lot of leverage can be dangerous. Now, one of my mentors was also a very successful business person who became a great collector, who lived in a very different environment than I did, where he would borrow at 14% to support his business. And people would say, why are you borrowing? And he said, because I can make 21%, right? So, I mean, different people have different risk tolerances too, which is it's all fine. I have a bit of a heterodox view of this. I think maybe for an institutional person or a museum person, I think financialization is good as long as people are really explicit about incentive structures and the timelines along which those incentive structures are aligned. I think that's another trip up, is someone thinks that someone is long in perpetuity and the other party is really thinking 5 years, but they never say that to each other. And then in year 3, you start wanting to make different sorts of decisions. But I think that bringing capital into ecosystems to support institutions and artists, as someone who runs an institution, I think thoughtfully doing that is good. I think using leverage unnecessarily because it looks cheap or you think that you have some arbitrage, right? Those things can be fleeting and they can create systemic risks. I think over leverage is bad. I think financialization done well can be really good.
I guess that leads me, Adam, to my final question for you, which is about financialization, because I think we are in a moment, and I'm somewhat obsessed with this, where I feel like culture is trying to be over financialized from every single aspect, and whether that is all of the social media platforms continually talking about creators and supporting creators and yet barely paying them for their output, even though they build the platforms, or it's the crypto artists who also now are dropping meme coins so that they can keep the hype around their name or the project, or maybe they saw the macro view go from NFTs to tokens. And the idea that everything can be tokenized, or the idea that someone wants to own the 3 Spider-Mans pointing at each other and be able to say, because I have that, I am invested in culture. I guess I always think about how many true artists I've met who just create art because they want to create art. And they don't, I think, discount the fact that they want to have a livelihood that supports their life by being able to be creative. But I do think people who look at the crypto art movement can often, in a very short-sighted way, say, oh, look at all these people jumping into buying these digital apes or these digital frogs or whatever. And that's not really art in certain people's views compared to an Osinachi or some of the other people that might be just utilizing a new medium to be creative, but they would be creative in any medium. And so I guess I just worry about, and I just want to get your thoughts on this idea of, are we generally over-financializing culture, over-financializing art with this idea of getting rich quick versus being an art patron who says, I'm supporting an artist because I love art and I want them to have a career.
Yeah, look, I know I probably sound like a total wet blanket in some ways, but it's both, right?
Adam never wants to take a side, Avery.
No, no, no. It's not about annoying people. It's that I think that you are rightly framing things as majority plurality or a sense of the vibe, right? And people who are commoditizing a space for short-term gain in any space can do really well in the short term, but the air comes out of that. People, get burned in the end. I would never advocate for that. And I do think that there is a lot of that going on. But also, by the way, like, just in the past few years, think about everything we've seen from meme stocks to SPACs, right? Like the moment there's something, people are in on it. So I don't think that it's crypto art specific or crypto specific for that matter. With that said, I think that there are more similarities between the art world and the financial world than sometimes either world allows for. So the companies that outperform are the companies that don't manage to quarterly earnings. They manage to the long term. They have a vision. Their employees have a sense of their purpose. They have a calling and they execute, and they might miss in a quarter, but they know that they're making long-term investments. Right? And all of the evidence shows that. The folks who are real patrons are the ones who end up with a more valuable art collection. Amazing how that works, right? Because they're investing in their value investing, or, these are current terms. Someone will listen to this and say, what a crass director. But it's actually about underlying quality. The metrics are different, but it's about underlying quality. So if the question is, can we develop legitimate and thoughtful financial mechanisms to support artists who produce quality, to support institutions? I think those are really good forms of financialization. Is that what gets the headlines? No. And if I had to guess, is that what the majority of financialization in the art world is? No. And so I can't opine on sort of whether something is good or bad, but what I do know is that there is good financialization. And sometimes there are good ideas that don't necessarily work. Like the Artist Pension Fund was an example of a really good idea that was poorly executed, maybe that didn't work as well as it should have, whatever the reasons were. There are ways to think about taking tools, leveraging them, making artists who are producing great authentic work, making their lives better, supporting their practice, allowing them to explore, and allowing institutions to thrive. Those I'm generally in favor of.
I think you're bringing up a really interesting point. I went to a talk last night, actually, where a woman who wrote this book called Get the Picture was talking about sort of that exact same concept. She was talking about a piece of art that she recently bought for $850. And, it doesn't always have to be like thousands of dollars, tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to build an amazing collection. So from your point of view, this is not financial advice. What artists do you see who are contemporaries today who will be foundational artists to know in the next 50 years, and not one who has done a residency with you?
Deal. So I guess I'll also say that in my tenure at the Toledo Museum of Art, since I've been the director, the most expensive work of art that we have acquired, it was $3.5 million. And the least expensive artwork we acquired was $2,500. And everything in that range, including those two works, was Toledo Museum of Art quality, the best of the best. So there is absolutely quality every step of the way. And I think I'm actually going to answer that question by saying, one of the ways that we have really focused our contemporary collecting activity has been to look at, to Sam's point, to go where artists are before they're necessarily represented by galleries in one of those centers, which if you're just listening to this, I put it in quotes because I think the centers are way more distributed in terms of talent, but the infrastructure may not be as developed as in some of these historic commercial loci. So I went to Lagos last year and I'm going back and bringing a group this year. I've been to Addis Ababa twice in the past couple of years. It's part of the reason that we're doing this Ethiopia at the Crossroads exhibition that I mentioned. We've had curators in Singapore and Hong Kong, of course, but also in the Philippines and in Seoul. So we're really trying to get out and find artists where they are. So that's not an answer to your question, Avery. You want a specific artist who hasn't done a residency with us. I think that there's incredible glass artists that did a residency with us. We also have a glass residency program named Beth Lippman, whose work is so deeply art historically engaged and is so thoughtful and produced a work for us, it's just one of the greatest things to take someone through this room-sized installation because there's no one whose mouth doesn't hit the ground, whose mouth doesn't hit the floor. So if you're going to force me to choose one person, Beth Lippman, whose work Regift is up at the Toledo Museum of Art right now, I'd be happy to go on, but I really rate an artist named Tesfaye Bekele, who is painting in Addis Ababa right now and has an incredible story. And I'm really looking forward to going and seeing some other artist studios shortly. More of a household name, but someone that is represented in our collection already, but continues to make astounding and important work is Yinka Shonibari, who I think is, already in the canon, but doing just such incredible things time and time again. I could go on, but there are just a few to show sort of the geographic breadth.
Only one of those has had a residency. So you did break the rules.
That's true. Sorry, I did, but not I think
Mostly
not a
no, but
digital artist residence. Yeah, I did right.
Adam, thank you for your time. We are excited actually to continue this discussion with Adam at Consensus this year. So Adam is going to be joining us to have a related discussion at Consensus in May. And we are all looking forward, I know Avery and I especially, of going to Toledo, seeing the glass installation. I've never been to Toledo myself, so I'm looking forward to that. But Adam, thank you for your time, all your sort of thoughtful answers, and frankly, education that both myself and hopefully the audience got something out of.
Gen C, I'm sure, is going to absolutely love this episode. A lot of good gems here. Adam, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it. See you in Austin.
I feel like I just learned a lot. The last 2 days have been a lot of art, listening and learning and thinking. And Adam was such a great guest. I feel like the Gen Z community is really going to like this episode.
Agreed. I spoke to Adam on a phone call right after, I'm going to say, Art Basel last year, where we were not able to meet, but we had meant to. And then we just ended up having, like, I was walking along the streets of New York City and we talked for an hour, and he just like blew my mind with a lot of his like contextual knowledge. So I thought he was someone who was really interested to have. And as one of the few museums that are putting on collections that include some of this digital and blockchain based art, and his bullishness on certain, again, not the technology, although he understands that, but the artists themselves, I really appreciate. Avery, I do feel like you travel so much. Do you just collect a piece everywhere you go?
I really should do that. No, I honestly try to be like a little bit minimalist. I don't have that much stuff, but I do collect from time to time, as you know, both sometimes at like art fairs and things like that, and just cool pieces that I see or things that I see that I'm like, I kind of like that.
Yeah, I'm with you. I collected a really long time ago and I've never stopped, but it really means you have to have a lot of storage
Space.
units or else.
Storage unit, space. It's just like there's constantly
Yeah, exactly. It's
not enough
everywhere
room
at
for
this point.
everything that I want to have because I actually love things. But I try to be very minimalist.
I appreciate that about you. Avery, thank you so much for today. As always, we will see you next week. Any last words for Gen C?
Have a great one, Gen C. We will see y'all next week. As always, let us know any thoughts, comments, feedback. Love to hear you all reaching out and sharing perspectives. So keep it coming.